Africa. South Africa emerged from apartheid with a mountain of socio-economic challenges. We were promised political freedom and material dignity. While some may argue that apartheid is relegated to history, we still do not have material dignity. We've got first on the panel Isobel Frye, who's the Director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality, who's the Director of an organization called Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, SPII. Interesting, SPII. So Isobel's going to be talking to us. Isobel's obviously done research. Her organization does research. She's going to be able to give us some facts and figures, which I think many of us don't know, because around statistics, we get all kinds of information that contradict each other. So first, poverty was, there was 14 million people going to bed hungry, and then it was 7 million, and then it's an Oxfam report which says something else. I think they said 12 million. So we need, and then Stats South Africa contradicts that. So we don't have information. Hopefully you can give us that information as well. So welcome, and thank you for being part of this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me. So nice to see old friends on our side of the panel, not yours. And just, I think that introduction was brilliant, because figures are something that many of us in South Africa don't touch because we're very scared of them. For me, I managed to get a standard grade maths pass, but that was kind of it. So I still have no idea if I have to make something into a percentage, whether you divide or multiply by 100. And I kind of, does that look right? Does it feel right? And then I just go approximately and use words. And yet stats can be really useful both to put your own or to aid your own analysis, and to enable you to understand what is behind other people's, either their propaganda or their analysis. All of my stats are from Stats SA. I find that within our organization, SPI, we've from quite an early stage embraced the official statistics, because when you start trying to debate on policy level with policymakers and you have alternative sources of facts, they just dispel your entire argument. I have too many slides, so how long do I have? I'm going to talk really quickly and you'll get the slides. Okay, so as part of the introduction, just to say that South Africa is an upper middle income country. So that is quite important in terms of the kind of aid that we get, but also if you look at the per capita distribution, the fact that people are living in poverty does not speak to the kind of resources that we have, but I'll come to that. Just useful facts that you can throw out in your next dinner party, not likely. 58 million people in South Africa, and officially we are the most unequal country in the world in terms of both income and wealth. That generally ends the dinner party. But the point that was just made, so after 1994, in 1996, we had our final constitution that was hailed as one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, because it promised or guaranteed equality, freedom, and dignity to all. But also we have socioeconomic rights, which are enshrined in the constitution specifically to redress the injustices of the past and to heal the indignities. So in terms of measuring poverty, again, as I said, Stats SA, I'm going to introduce a poverty measure that we've been working on. But Stats SA has got three official poverty lines. You have the food poverty line of 547 Rand per person per month, the lower bound poverty line of 785 Rand per person per month, and an upper bound poverty line of 1,183 Rand per person per month. That's 2018 figures, they get updated every year. So just to explain these, in short, the food poverty line measures the cost of the least amount of food needed to survive for any individual. It's based on WHO, World Health Organization statistics, but basically below that, you're not actually able to sustain yourself in any useful way. And then I hate the lower bound poverty line. So in order to calculate the lower bound poverty line, they look at the expenditure items of people whose income approximates the food poverty line, and they identify those things that people are buying instead of food. So basically, the things that people are willing to starve themselves more for in order to acquire, that gets grouped and costed, and that gets added to the lower bound, the food poverty line, to get the lower bound poverty line, and the upper bound poverty line is an amalgamation of the two of them. So when we call them poverty lines, they actually are incredibly survivalist lines, and that must be kept in mind. So if those are the three poverty measures, how do we rate? The stats that I'm giving you next come from a 2015 study, but all the stats I use are the most up-to-date that are available. And just when you look at the next slide, just consider how much it is that you spend in totality per month in order to rate where it is that you find yourself on this. So this is an invisible graph to most of you. Upper bound poverty line, lower bound poverty line, food poverty line. So 25% of people in South Africa fall below the food poverty line. So 1 in 4 South Africans are not actually able to meet their basic food-only needs. Lower bound poverty line, 40% of South Africans, 55.5% of South Africans fall below the upper bound poverty line. So more than 1 in 2 people in South Africa are officially poor. This is just useful for you to look at late at night. I think it's also important, of course, to note distribution and basically redistribution has not taken place. So basic 64.2% in the last statistics of Black Africans fall below the upper bound poverty line, by far more than the white South Africans or any other racial category. I think the important thing to see is just a kind of a little bit of an analysis, well, kind of looking at figures here. So the cost of feeding a small child is 563 Rand 50. Cost of feeding, that's age 3 to 9. 10 to 13 is 600 Rand. In South Africa, we are an upper middle income country. 30% of boy children under 5 are stunted, which means they have both physical and other developmental challenges. 1 in 4 girls. So looking at that and just remembering that 563 Rand for the cost of feeding a child. Looking at social grants now. So people complain that the poor are lazy and depend on handouts and grants. Child support grant, of which 12.3 million are distributed to children, is only 420 Rand per child per month. So you ask what the shortfall is. Old age grant, 3.5 million older people get it, 1,780 Rand. So again, this is not exactly what people are going to give up a lucrative career to qualify for. In addition to that, there is no social security for working age people between the ages of 18 and 59. So if you are unemployed, that's tough. The national minimum wage, which was adopted at the beginning of this year, I should know, I'm a commissioner, it's 3,500 Rand per month. That's very contentious, and many of us who are part of the negotiations see that as a floor rather than a ceiling. But I mean, that certainly is not sufficient to feed adequately or to take people out of poverty, especially when you look at the average number of South Africans supported by one wage is 3.5 people. So any income needs to be divided by that in order to see the per capita. So a number of us, it was SPII, Labour Research Service, LRS, and SPII, which is the Social Policy Research Institute, for a number of years have been working on something which we call a decent standard of living. For us, it was an anathema to dignity of people to actually just look at the poverty measures as defined by Stats SA. So in essence, we came up with, over a number of years, a decent standard of living. And that was really, the question was, how much would it cost for each South African to live a decent life in South Africa? So it's a minimal but decent life, not a survivalist life. And we had 48 focus groups across the country to ask people that question. So it wasn't scientifically derived in any way, or sort of thumb sucking and reducing things. It was asking people, what do you think? And basically, a selection of goods was then taken into account, and we derived 21 socially perceived necessities, which we then took. So this necessities is not a basket of goods. The 21 SPNs are indicators of the type of income range that people who can live a decent life live. And so basically looking at 2018, the cost of a decent standard of living was 7,043 Rand per person per month. And that's something which we updated. We've just updated it now to 7,300. But as you can see, it's far above any of the official poverty measures. And I think this tells it all. 3% of the population have access to all 21 SPNs. 1.7 million people. And then again, just to give you a sense of the income coming through here, the 21 SPNs, that's 7,043 Rand per person per month. The minimum wage comes in at just half of that. The lower bound poverty line is there and the child support grant is there. So that's child support grant, the survivalist food poverty line, lower bound poverty line, upper bound poverty line, minimum wage, decent standard of living. And these are all other indicators that look to either social grants or wage, basically basic sector wage agreements. I think one of the things that we don't see in this country is the huge density of people in poverty, and how that skews most of people's living potential, because all we look to is the elites. Okay, so some more cheerful news. Labor market indicators, this was taken from the first quarter labor force survey. So essentially in South Africa, about 16.2 million people are officially employed. Note that that includes both the formal sector and informal sector, and agricultural work and private households. So that's basically domestic workers. So that all constitutes employed. 6.2 million unemployed. So you can see that there are more people employed. You'd think that was okay. Then we get to this category called not economically active. Not economically active are working age people who are not economically active. So they are not in school, they are not in training, they are not in work. Just under 3 million are now classified as discouraged work seekers. They're people who've given up looking for work. And then you have other. So we've got about 13 million other people in this country who are not unemployed. So we don't have to worry about them. But they're not getting income. So you can see the official, the official unemployment rate, which excludes the not economically active, is 27.6%. But the expanded unemployment rate was 38%. So basically, everyone says statistics are lies. You just need to understand the definition. So employed are those 15 to 64 years who during the reference week did any job for at least 1 hour, or had a job or business or not at work. So if you work for 1 hour in a week, you're counted as employed. In fact, it gets quite, if you fix up your house, it's seen as being productive work, so you are employed. Informal employment, basically the precarious employment situations, not entitled to basic benefits, pension, but that's still regarded as employed. So the not unemployed but not employed, 15.7 million. That is the category of people that scare me, because no policies take them into account. We've defined people out of existence, and that's very stupid when it comes to policy making, as well as illegal, unconstitutional, etc. Okay, so 38% expanded, 6.2 million people employed, 3 million employed people are employed in the informal economy, another 3 million are discouraged, another 12.7 million are not economically active. And this is also quite significant. 2/3 of the formerly unemployed are classified as long-term unemployed. That means unemployed for longer than a year. And globally, once you've been out of employment for a year, your chances of getting a new job are very slim, on the assumption that the workplace has moved on and you haven't. This is something which you can look at. It's just a kind of provincial comparison, and the definition or the codes are here: unemployment rate, expanded unemployment rate. I just want to say, Stats SA is really great. If you have free time, look at the survey data. You can ask it some interesting questions. So interestingly, if you're looking at where people are, so this is the unemployment rate in the provinces. So the Western Cape has the lowest unemployment rate, and they actually fell in terms of employment in the first quarter. Eastern Cape has got the highest at 48%, so almost half the people in the Eastern Cape is still there, of working age don't have a job. And you can see the other big province of sort of industrialized province, Gauteng, 33.6%. And it's evident when you also look at the migratory patterns, especially in the rural provinces, working age people leave, and that's still what's left behind. Okay, so just something which I looked at are the returns on education, because in essence, if you look at the characteristics of the unemployed, 56% have less than matric. 34, so this is not to say nationally, this is of the unemployed. 56 have less than matric, 34% have matric. Interestingly enough, 7% have other tertiary compared to 2.1% of the unemployed have a university degree. So there is a kind of hierarchy there in terms of what is more acceptable. And so then the question is, well, if that's the return on education, why not go to school? So the recent GHS, the General Household Survey, listed the reasons for not going to school. And this is interesting because we've got about, 24% saying no money for fees. 22% got academically excluded from school, if you can get that at school. Anyway, it was poor academic performance. Family commitments, much higher amongst girls compared to 0.2% of boys, so that's essentially pregnancy. Education is useless. 11.8% of boys who dropped out said they did so because education is useless. 3.9% of girls. So that's sort of interesting. You can start trying to piece together some stories there. And yet you can see, although if you look back, that first category was no money for fees, and then you think, well, maybe policy should change. Yet in 2018, 67.2% of individuals, it says it all, aged 5 and older who attended schools and didn't pay tuition fees. So that's been a significant increase from the state in terms of providing fee-free education. And yet it's clearly not satisfying the kind of standards that are required. Okay, so this is another sobering number of slides. So the NEETs are not in education, not in employment, education, or training. So you can see the very high levels of people who are not in the system within the youth category. If you just look at that, so I was using the expanded definition because I think that's the one you should. People aged between 15 and 24, so basically so you have a 70% unemployment rate. So those are the people who are inheriting the labor force, social reproduction of society, and the political economy. You can see that decreases. On the right-hand side, you can see a steady increase. I mean, it's just quarter on quarter, but that's the longer-term trajectory. And again, I mentioned this beforehand. It follows race as well. So 42 or 43% of Black Africans were, of the unemployed, 43% were Black African, 29% colored, 16% Indian Asian, and 10% white. Okay, so that I've spoken to the long-term unemployment. I was trying to be smart with these slide things that didn't exactly work. One of the things that you need to look out for is which industries are shedding, or which sectors are shedding jobs, and I'm sure Devan will speak more to this. There's a slide there which just shows, I mean, essentially a big loss in construction, private households, but what we can see is that some of that was influenced by the Eskom load shedding, if you look at the kind of construction trade, manufacturing. Okay, so in conclusion, what are the plans to get us out of here? Well, because we can't read any of what I've said. So if you look at the National Development Plan 2030, It's a very brave plan. It has 12 pages of vision, which continues. So they said there, eliminate any households falling below the lower bound poverty line. And remember, that was the middle one by 2030. And that was in 2012, it was 39%. By 2015, it had risen to over 40%, so wrong direction. Reduce inequality from 0.69 to 0.6. This is my big bugbear as well. 0.6 is a huge outlier globally in terms of inequality. So the class project in terms of the NDP is very clear. It's maintain the elites, just try and reduce the extremes of the poor. Proportional national income, increase employment to 24 million. Reduce unemployment rate to 6%. That's interesting. And raise per capita income. So I promise you, I've just got one more slide after this. So how we do this is the average annual GDP growth should be 5.4%. We all know that that's about sort of hovering at about 1.2%. Develop proposals for the acceptable minimum standard of living and a social compact. In essence, what the NDP said was improve the social wage so that you don't have to increase employment wage, so that you can increase production by paying slave wages. And yeah, I mean, there is absolutely no, reduce the cost of living for the poor through micro reforms to improve the social wage. I mean, that's not putting bread on the table, let alone equaling out distribution. But what I picked up in this most recent State of the Nation, so remember, the NDP said middle poverty line. Cyril gets lots of headlines by saying, oh, we are, as government in this next administration and a half, hopefully, are going to eliminate the number of people falling below the food poverty line by 2030. So they've just changed their own target from the middle poverty line to the lower poverty line. And there was very little kind of effect of anyone picking that up. I mean, a lot of this is just so mismatched. Aim to create 2.5 million jobs for young people by 2030. I mean, we already have 2.4 million kids, younger people, between 15 and 24 who are not employed, and 3.8 million people between 26 and 34. So add those together. I mean, yeah, I mean, the scale is just not fitting. And then again, because we've already been able to ignore the other, the not economically active. I mean, and the other point is, so instead of the 5.4% growth rate, they said, Cyril said, we'll aim for a national growth rate to keep ahead of the population growth. Population growth is currently about 1.5% per annum. So, I mean, we kind of reducing that, but not indicating how that is going to in any way absorb the kind of unemployed and look at redistribution. So one of the things that we at SPII are trying to promote is, I know everyone is sick of commissions, but we really think we need to have a standing commission on poverty, not something which comes up every time there's a labour force survey, or census, that we don't seem to be doing censi anymore. But just to have a consistent mapping of poverty and inequality. And I know that this is a university, but one of my bugbears with academia is that there's a huge amount of money being pumped into research on poverty and inequality, and it doesn't seem to be shared. And it doesn't seem to be shared with the policymakers, and the policymakers don't seem to want to see it. Stats SA is struggling to be able to roll out any of their surveys. And I think they definitely need to have more funding on that. So your living conditions survey, and your income and expenditure survey, because unless we have the data, we don't know what's going on, which might be the intention. And one of the things that have happened twice are poverty hearings. So in 2008, in 1998, and probably before you were born. And then in 2008 again, we had poverty hearings which were nationally held. Initially, it was basically just after the TRC, and it was to give people the opportunity to be heard about the indignities that apartheid poverty had caused them. And then civil society organized the 2008 one, Sangoko, which no longer exists. And it sounds like a simple thing, but it's really important to enable people to have that space. And for that to become part of the national discourse, because it's the lived reality for more people than it is not. And yet none of the media is really interested in that unless you have some tragedy, and then it gets it. So, yeah, I mean, the poverty proofing of policies, and other countries have done that. Any policy that gets introduced, there is an assessment as to how it's going to impact on poverty, inequality, unemployment. So it might well do so for the short term, but at least people need to be aware of that. The new medium-term strategic framework, looking at wealth and asset redistribution, basically where we are is a national crisis, and it's a silent crisis, because nobody who has the ability to do anything to change it really seems to have any intention to. So thank you very much. And as I said, that will come to you, I'm sure. And that's where you can go and read it all up for yourself. Thanks.
Thank you, Isobel. Those stats were alarming. I'm a little disappointed that your session didn't come before the session we had this morning, because now you would be armed with some facts to ask more questions of the presidency and also of our head of economics. But be that as it may, we've learned now, and next time we might be able to kind of bring that together. I want to just point out the one statistic. When we spoke about a means-tested grant, not the universal grant this morning, when we spoke about mean-tested grant, and we spoke about child-headed households, or the grant itself, the child care grant, which young women, as the head of economics stated this morning, young women are having children because they can get the 420. But that 420 is even less than what you say is needed for a child per month. So that was 570, I think you noted, and that was 420. So that's not even sufficient to raise a child. I'd like to introduce Professor Devan Pillay, who I'm told was supervised by South Africa's most famous Marxist, which I didn't know, Harold Walpe. And Prof. Pillay is going to be talking to us about a paper he's written on, let me just get that title now, I just wrote it down now. Global Crisis of Inequality and its South African Manifestation. You want to come up front, please? So that they can deal with you.
Thanks, Karuna. Afternoon, everyone. Have you woken up now? I'm not going to, I've circulated this paper, which I wrote a short while back, and I think Isobel's got more updated facts and figures, but nevertheless, there's, and I don't want to bombard you with more facts and figures. I think you got the picture. Just to make one initial point, and that is, while South Africa, there's a big debate as to whether Brazil or South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, and there's some debate about whether the Gini coefficient is an accurate measure or not, etc. So this inequality Olympics, I'm not particularly impressed by. We know that it's a dire situation. But the point I want to make is that we are a microcosm of a global crisis of inequality. You're not unique, right? And once you look at the global dimension of inequality, you realize that our particular racialized form of inequality is not, in my opinion, and from a Marxist Buddhist analysis, it is not, eco-socialists will come. It's not, for us, it's clearly the racialized nature of inequality is clearly a manifestly unjust and fact that we can't escape. But for me, it's not a fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is class inequality. The nature of capitalist development and how it generates this inequality. In particular, what is called neoliberal capitalism. I think you may have dealt with some of this during the week, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how many Marxists you had during the week, so maybe I shouldn't assume. And so this global dimension and the global historical dimension or understanding will emphasize this point, right? So just one statistic I'll give you from Oxfam, which does a lot of work on measuring, recording global inequality. So this was in 2016, and I'm sure the situation has got worse. But the richest 1% in the whole world, the richest 1% receives 14% of global income, while the poorest 20% receives just over 1%. Now, to put that another way, a more blatant stat is that the richest 62 people in the world, right? 62 people owns as much wealth as the poorest 3.2 billion people. So over the past 5 years, the richest 62 people saw their wealth increase by 45%, while the poorest half of the world population saw wealth decrease by 38%. So you've got this completely obscene intensification of global inequality, particularly since the 1980s, right, when global capitalism unleashed itself, when the state withdrew from the economy, when finance capitalism quite rapidly, the controls over their expansion were removed. And you have what is called some people call a counter-revolution against the working class. It's all part of a class struggle, but this time it's the class struggle of the rich against the poor that has intensified over the past 3 or 4 decades. It was always there, of course, with the advent of capitalism. That's the nature of capitalism, as Marx says. All history is a history, all known history is a history of class struggle, of the oppressed against the oppressor. But these levels of inequality, as an author, an economist by the name of Thomas Piketty, do you know him? Have you heard of him? He's written this study, and he says we are reaching 19th century levels of global inequality. So we are not unique in that sense, although we could argue that our levels of unemployment and inequality are certainly higher than most other countries. But China is catching up. India is catching up with us in terms of inequality, right? Expanded inequality in China, expanding at a rapid rate. Inequality in India is expanding at a rapid rate. Although some would argue, well, poverty in China has also improved. Nevertheless, we're talking about inequality. Now, so we are this microcosm, and I worry about how we categorize or conceptualize these issues can be very important. And in fact, the categories we use can be, actually I like this word, I think it comes from the USA, can be weaponized. Does it come from USA? I tend to want to avoid US jargon, or the woke generation. I don't know how many of you are part of the woke generation. You import all this stuff from the USA and we think we are being new and hip. But we are so American, it's amazing, unconsciously. But I like that one, the weaponization of concepts. So the weaponization of white monopoly capitalism. While empirically, yes, you can say that the economy is dominated by a certain demographic. When you weaponize it as those who have been involved in state capture have done so and continue to do so. What you are saying is, what you are trying to do is, you are trying to replace white monopoly capitalism with black monopoly capitalism. But even that might be too nice a way to put it, because for them, for the Zuptas, you know the Zuptas. For the Zuptas, it wasn't even going to be, black monopoly capitalism might still be not a bad thing, because they were going to actually not allow for for capitalist development, which can have some positive trickle-down effects. They were going to actually collapse the whole state, right? As we all know, with Eskom, once the most regarded as the most efficient state enterprise, is now virtually bankrupt and has to be bailed out. Most state enterprises, SARS, our tax collection service was almost destroyed. And we have a public protector now who's also been captured, trying to fight back on behalf of this Zupta nexus. So we've got to be careful how we use categories. And for me, the fundamental issue is the primary contradiction is this class contradiction. And some people also have finessed the argument and say, well, it's not just a capitalist class that is the dominant class. We've got to look at the nature of the power elite in our society. What is the power elite? Who's really in power? And so there are two dimensions to it for the power elite perspective. They are the state elites and the private sector elites, or the economic elites. And some conventional Marxists tend to only focus on the economic elites, whereas it's important to see how the two sets of elites, the one in this country is predominantly white, that's the economic elite, but not exclusively white. And the other, the state elites, are predominantly black. And they are in competition with each other, but also have a symbiotic relationship. So we need to understand the nature of power, class power, and how the state elites and the economic elites interact with each other, because they have a common interest in expropriating much of the surplus produced in society for themselves. That is the nature of inequality. That's what's been happening at an intensified level over the past 3 or 4 decades. How this small minority, whether in the state or whether in the private sector, are expropriating what is produced by the working class, right, paid a much lower wage, by this elite. So all of us are part of it, and you are all potentially part of it. We've come into a globalized economy after 1994, and we've adopted a globalized economy and what we inherited from the apartheid economy. But even then, I would argue that the levels of inequality were less between the elite and the working class, arguably, because those who earn at the top have just started earning exponentially more, right? The CEO of ShopRite Checkers, who is no longer the CEO now, but he has an unfortunate name, Whitey Basson, but that's a misnomer because that's not the issue. Because you look at the CEO of MTN, who is a black man, or even the head of Eskom, etc., how much they earn. But Whitey Basson earned 600 million in 1 year, right? And the business, they defended that, said, no, you are jealous. Why? He earned money for his company, so he's entitled to that. So the issue of entitlement by the elite is now deeply entrenched. And they're saying, but Whitey Basson, if you translate these 600 million into dollars, it's only about $40 million. So, oh, I'm underpaid compared to Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who earns 100 times more, right? So that's how they measure their deprivation. I'm sure you know about football stars. I'm sure you follow, some of you follow European football, right? And how much these guys earn. And they'll say, oh, he's underpaid. He's only getting 300,000 pounds a week. Only 300,000 pounds. No, he's underpaid. He must get 600,000 pounds a week, right? Now that's, of course, the madness of globalized capitalism. And football, which I love, follows the pattern of global capitalism very, very closely. Study football, you'll understand global capitalism unleashed, right? Of course, it wasn't always as bad as this, because there was a period after the Second World War up until the 1970s when many countries we had different forms of, let's say, social democratic economies or in state intervention, etc., where they mitigated these excesses. In Japan today, you won't find the same levels of inequality as you have in the USA. We follow the US model. In the Scandinavian countries, you don't find the same levels of inequality, right? Because they're still adhering to a social solidaristic type of economy, of course, under strain because of global capitalism. And so now Isobel mentioned growth. We need growth to get out of this. I just want to add a caution. Yes, of course, economic growth is an important part of our development trajectory. But what is growth? We've got to be very careful how we use economic growth as a big mantra. You know what a mantra is? When you say something over and it's like mesmerizes you. And we see growth as the solution to all our problems. But if you unpack what growth is, now all countries in the 20th century, all types of economies, whether you are socialist, social democratic, or capitalist, pre-market capitalist, growth is unquestioned. GDP growth, gross domestic product, or gross national product. I think somebody, I was told, did mention to you that there's an alternative called gross national happiness, an alternative way of understanding development. What are we developing for, right? And what growth does not, growth measurements do not take into account are what I call the environment. It takes into account the economic goods, but it does not take into account the environmental bads. How much you take out of the earth, how much you pollute the earth. The massive amount of destruction happening around the world today, contributing to both climate change and to resource depletion. How much wealth has gone out of the African continent to rich countries, right? The real wealth, and how much they get back in return. Their GDP growth can be very high. We've been told the last few years that Africa is growing at a wonderful rate. But if you look closely, how is it growing? How much wealth is actually through mining being extracted from these countries? So what type of growth is very, very important. And how, of course, and whether it is jobless growth and how that surplus that is produced is redistributed, of course, are all critical parts of that. So how did we get to this point in South Africa where we, the liberation movement that came into power, I was part of that liberation movement. We had very different dreams in the 1980s. They all subscribed to socialism back then. Then they moderated to social democracy, fine, so good. And then by the time they got to power, they adopted neoliberalism. I mean, how did that happen? What was happening there? It's still a mystery. of course, the insertion into this global economy is a key explanatory factor, relying on the market forces and investment from outside to generate growth and jobs, which never really came to the extent that was hoped for. But black economic empowerment, a critical integration of that, is also part of the explanation. There again, we focus on the racial content of capitalism rather than on the nature of capitalism itself as a class project. So what we did was, through BEE, which is understandable because you want to de-racialize the capitalist class and create a patriotic bourgeoisie, as it were, we find that actually what was happening was you found Cyril Ramaphosa is one example of this, but a whole range of others became very wealthy by hitching themselves to monopoly capital in this country. So to be more specific, capitalism is a problem, but monopoly capitalism is a global problem. And in South Africa, it's a particularly important problem to identify. The banks are monopolized. Bread industry, the bread price, 2 companies, I think. The food chain, monopolized. In America, it's highly monopolized. We are doing the same here, or we have done the same here, etc. We go through all sectors of the economy. And what has happened was that new black businessmen, or black business class, that was the focus, right, of transformation. In the 1980s, transformation meant something very different to what actually happened after 1984. Transformation became about changing the racial composition of the oppressing or the elite class. But they were also tied to existing monopoly capital. So they had no incentive to invest in manufacturing, right? Have any of you heard of Mabece Mbeki, the former president's brother? He's written a lot on this. And he said, well, we've not created an entrepreneurial class. Why? Because of the monopoly form of capitalism to be perpetuated, right? There are a whole range of other things we didn't do, or encourage or promote. Small business development, particularly in township economies. What do we do instead? We allow the big monopolies to go into the townships, and so they out-compete small businesses. They're not allowed to breathe, not allowed to grow. Pick and Pays or ShopRite, etc. Initiatives that were started around allowing people to sustain themselves given this high unemployment. Now, this is also a global phenomenon to bear in mind, that capitalism, global capitalism today, is unable to create enough jobs for everyone, let alone decent jobs. It's unable to. Once you get that fact clearly into our heads, we can then be much more clearly focused on whether we are pursuing a decent life for all or decent jobs for all. Now, if you're looking at it from a decent life perspective, and that's where the happiness principle comes in, we look at a whole range of other types of economic activity that can allow people to be self-sustaining and to live a better life. So for example, just one example, before I stop there, I think I've gone on for quite long. There was an initiative for it, right? We all know how much vacant plots of land. If you go around Johannesburg, you'll see a lot of vacant plots. If you go around the townships, you'll see vacant plots of land. There was an initiative through the Communist Party. This is an example, right? About 20 years ago, to develop food gardens, right, in communities. And it started to achieve some success, but got no support by the leadership of the Communist Party. The trade unions, where were they? Absent. They didn't see this as an opportunity because it's not about getting members for them. Now you've seen what happened in a country like Cuba when they had a huge economic crisis. They developed food gardens throughout the city, communities, they empowered communities to feed themselves and then to sell excess produce, right, to neighbors. So you are specializing in certain types of produce, maybe you are specializing in fruit, they're specializing in vegetables, you can, trade. Organic produce, right? In this country, we've got a communist party that supposedly always lauds Cuba. We have a trade union movement like NUMSA, etc. They always praise Cuba, but they refuse to even look at this dimension because it's not sexy, right? So if we think differently beyond just a narrow paradigm of decent work, of formal jobs, and much more creatively around how do we create sustainable livelihoods for people, or the opportunities, how do we open up those opportunities, we could achieve a lot more, I believe. Let me stop there. There's a lot more I can say. I never mentioned religion, which Karuna said I must. I don't believe in God. There we are.
Thank you, Prof. Pillay. Again, there's information and a critical perspective on a lot of what was said this morning. So in future, we would have to bring people of not like minds together on a panel so that we can actually really interrogate issues as well. I'm going to introduce Uyanda. He was one of you not so very long ago. No, how many years ago? 2011, 2012. He was on the SRC. That's where I know him from. And he is here now as the director. Oh, as what? Mobilization manager of an organization called Fighting Inequality Alliance. So clearly they're 2 years old and they hoping to bring many organizations who are in this area campaigning against inequality. Thank you, Uyanda. You'd have to sit here. Are you going to stand?
Morning, everyone. Oh, afternoon, everyone, rather. Here we go. As Karuna said, my name is Uyanda Mabece. I am from the Fight Inequality Alliance, which is a global movement of human rights organizations, international NGOs, community-based organizations, civil society actors and partners working on the particular issue of inequality, which is our theme for discussion today. So I think what I wanted to do for my presentation a little bit is, because I'm a fan of history a little bit, just to touch on the historical context around inequality in South Africa and how we're getting to a point where we are now. And Comrade Isobel spoke quite well around, where we are post 1994 and the positions and the policies that the government has taken. So for me, I think on the topic of inequality in South Africa, we can never really look at it holistically without looking at the contextual history we're coming from. And if you go back as far as the 17th century, going as far back as the 17th century, South Africa was sort of in a situation where, obviously, with the advent of colonialism, particularly in South Africa, it created quite a number of issues going forward for us. And particularly in South Africa, what it also did was to also entrench inequality along race, class, and gender lines, and eventually, over time, widen the gap between the rich and poor. So in South Africa, the roots of inequality are deeply linked to the past that we've had as a country. And whilst we cannot, undo the history that we've had as a country, I think it's important for us to sort of recognize and understand that history has an important role to play, particularly one of a history which is steeped in slavery, in dispossession, brutal wars, which have also further inculcated the structures of inequality and poverty which we see today. So linked to this, I think if you go forward through time, what we also see is that particularly within the South African context, particularly in the 1900s, we saw the discovery, inverted commas, of gold and other minerals, gold, particularly gold, as a mineral resource in the country. And that sort of led to a drive in capitalism, linked to what Prof. Pillay was talking about, the global forces coming together to try and extract resources. And put in the South African context, our economy is largely sort of structured around uh, the extractives industry. So we're always extracting, taking out, and it's being sold elsewhere, as Prof spoke quite well about. Um, at the same time, part of that history is one where the state at the time was using laws such as the 1913 Land Act to further entrench, particularly the Black African majority into poverty, using their cheap labor, using relying on migrant labor system to extract cheap labor from black people, dispossessing the land in order to ensure that those people are reliant on the capitalist system to enrich themselves as an elite. Um, Going forward as well, what we saw, I think, given that South Africa's history is I mean, South Africa's history is largely linked to the mining sector. There are also things like the Mine and Workers Act of 1923, which also further entrenches further entrenched inequality and the forms of inequality which we see today in South Africa. This was obviously coupled by apartheid in 1948 until its fall in 1990s. And particularly in this period, we see a rise in these regressive laws which are undermining, which are dehumanizing, which have really had a massive impact on where we are as a country. Not to say that post 1994, South Africa didn't have many opportunities to change that, which I think it did. Um, so, and also I think also with apartheid as well, which is important to mention as well, is that what it also did was it created an environment and a space for big business to essentially get away with murder, uh, both literally and figuratively. In that, not only did it encourage the apartheid system, but it also directly benefited from it. And I know Prof. Devan would tell us quite a lot about, the negotiations process of the 1990s, CODESA and others, where the state was trying to sort of uh, get, those make those companies pay for the amount, the impact that they've had on South Africa, um, on South Africa, on black people in this country. Um, yeah, so I think South Africa South Africa in 1994 was at a huge crossroads in terms of how it approaches the challenges of its past and the plan that it puts together going forward. And it had an opportunity to essentially transform society. That was the aim, that was the spirit, that was the intention. But we, we can see some of the benefits of those efforts. But at the same time, I mean, the figures cited by Isobel are quite shocking. If we're saying we're a democratic country, or rights respecting country, we've got our uh, economic, social, and cultural rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights, but the everyday lived realities of people isn't speaking to that, or doesn't show that that's where we're headed as a country. Um, I know there was the figure spoken about around the Gini coefficient. Um, um, Comrade Isabel spoke about that, and just as a figure, she mentioned how it's calculated and so forth. In 1994, it was sitting at around 0.59, which is already quite high, right, in terms of inequality, and and that has risen quite extensively, where we see it sitting at around 0.669%. You know. In 2015. So I mean that's quite alarming. Essentially, it means that whatever policies that the government put in place, your RDP, your gear, it failed to really transform this country. What it in fact did was further entrench inequality that we see, and further entrench and push people further, particularly the black majority in this country, into poverty. Um, this country, yeah. So I think the other thing as well, I think with some of the the policies, your reconstruction and development program, your gear program, your NDP, which is also spoken about. But particularly with I think with the negotiations and with the RDP policy by the state, one thing I think the ANC was trying to do was to sort of achieve, um, you know, address the inequalities of the past through uh, rather achieve growth, right, through through wealth distribution, right? Whereas the capitalists and the global forces, big business and others, were pushing for the other way around, where if we have growth, we'll have if we have growth, we'll be able to transform society, we'll be able to redistribute wealth and so forth. And the figures around that are quite alarming because it actually hasn't happened. It hasn't achieved those levels. It hasn't, improved the lives of ordinary South Africans in the way that it should have. So uh, today, South Africa is considered one among the most unequal societies in the world, and this is also, heavily linked to our history of exclusion across racial lines, across gender lines, and only a small fraction of the population are gaining directly from population gain directly from this sustained economic growth, or even sustained economic growth that's been spoken about over the years. So just a figure as well. I think I'll cite a figure that I thought was quite interesting as well, or a stat rather. South Africa's three richest billionaires have the same wealth as the poorest 50% of the population. So the three richest people in South Africa have the same wealth as 50%, the majority, the bottom 50% of the population. This is a stat coming from Oxfam, which is an organization that we're working with on the issues of inequality. Um, and Also, the stat goes on to say that 42% of the nation's economy and wealth are controlled by just 1% of the population. So again, massive disparities where a small handful of elites have power, are controlling the economy, are controlling how things operate in the country, and are essentially extracting every last ounce of blood. There's an expression, uh, a pound of flesh, an ounce of blood. So capitalism essentially does that, and that's what inequality has done, or those that have benefited from inequality have done, is to extract that pound of flesh and ounce of blood from every single person, and obviously then paying meager wages to those people to try and you've done a good job, but you're only worth so much. This is the value that you have. This is your particular value. So I think a lot of the sort of conversation that we've had so far that have spoken about inequality. I've spoken about it, in terms of the one measure of inequality, which is wealth and income inequality, right? But there are also other various forms of inequalities which we can also look at to sort of assess how we've done as a country over the years. We've spoken quite a lot about wealth income inequality, but there's also, gender inequality, which is a massive challenge. Where we're seeing, and gender inequality in particular is also linked to poverty and inequality, and provides a particular gender dynamic, because that's exactly what it is. Poverty in South Africa is gendered, inequality in this country is gendered. So when we speak about gender inequality, we refer to both economic inequality and between genders, right? So we've seen a lot of the stats. I mean, our national team was playing yesterday, and performed quite poorly. And just as a quick comparison, I mean, if you look at the amount of money that male football players, for example, get compared to their female counterparts, it's astronomical. And this is along those gender lines, right? Because it's women footballers, because there's a lot less capital investment in women's football because of the patriarchal nature of society and so forth. They deserve to be paid less. This is what their value is. And this obviously also plays out in our homes, right? In our own societies, where we see women earning less in society broadly than men. Number one, we see the roles that are distributed between men and women in the household are not the same, right? And they're not the same. Men are supposed to be going out there, working and bringing home, the bacon, inverted commas, or the let's call it bacon to be, uh, appropriate, culturally sensitive and appropriate. Um, oh yes, bringing home, yes, yes, bringing home the tofu, I suppose. We've got one for you as well. So yeah, so I mean, this is the structure that we're dealing with, especially in our homes as well, right? Where we're seeing um, uh, women, having particular roles in the household, and their labor, right, is not necessarily measured and valued at the same level as those of men. Things like looking after the children is not considered uh, an income producing activity. Things like making sure the house is clean and so forth, and other things is not considered an income producing activity. And this is unpaid labor, right, of women, which is also one of the ways in which we can sort of look at inequality and how it plays itself out, how it plays itself out. The other one I think, which is also quite important. I mean, we are an institution of higher learning, and we can look at education inequality, right? And with education inequality, um, there's a strong correlation between educational attainment and the standards of living. This was the stats among the stats that Isobel showed us. So essentially, you are more likely to succeed, you are more likely to be well off, you're more likely to earn a decent income if you're educated than you're not. And obviously, this also buys into the neoliberal capitalist ideas around what education is supposed to achieve. I think that's just a disclaimer that I had to put in there because I know Prof was part of the panel as well. So the other flip side is that we see education as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. So that's something which is also quite important, I think, when we're looking at inequality, not just gaining education for the sake of it, but gaining education to achieve some other end rather than you know the value of understanding the value of education in terms of how we freely think and how we analyze and view society and how we interrogate the world. The other one, which is also quite important as well, I think, is around health inequality. And this is an inequality which refers to both the health status and the health care between groups, right? So, like, similar to education, health leads to inequality in other spheres of our lives. It affects health affects people's ability to be productive. Health affects people's ability to enjoy a decent standard of living, and to participate in other areas of life. The other one, which I think is also quite important, particularly from the South African perspective, is around the differences that exist between households, and these are also along racial lines as well, and also within racial groups or within a location. So in South Africa, however, what we're seeing is that there's a growing concern regarding intra-house inequality, right? So this is inequality between various households. Um, and intra-house inequality refers to inequality within particular households. It's not enough to identify a household as being poor or not poor, but it's also necessary to examine each person's welfare within that particular household. So how are you living within a particular household? What are you accessing? How are you living? What are you accessing? How is your day-to-day existence? I think that's also quite an important aspect around inequality. And obviously, these are also quite increasing quite a lot. Um, Obviously linked to the global trends that we've seen, but also in South Africa, I think it's one of those inequalities which we don't really delve deep enough into. We always focus on, income inequality as the main theme, as the main sort of broad theme in which we sort of interrogate inequality. Now, I'm going to speak a little bit about our organization, the Fight Inequality Alliance, and what we're doing to try and address and change and work to fight against some of these inequalities. Um, so we have a 10-point plan. It's not like the 7 pillars of other political organizations, but we have a 10-point plan, right? And our plan looks at the need to. So how we work as an organization. Let me start there. How we work as an organization is that we work with various groups to mobilize them in the fight against inequality, because we understand fundamentally that this is all about power at the end of the day. Those that have power and those that don't have power, and those that do have power using that power to advance their own interests, advance the particularly narrow interests. So what we are doing as an organization is we need particularly governments and organizations and groups that we're working with to challenge the state to take concrete action to close the gap between the rich and the rest, right? So we've seen the figures. I've cited the figures around the rich 1%, the rich 10%, and so forth. And at, what we're looking at right now is that In 2015, just another stat as well is that uh, the richest 1% had more wealth than the rest of the world, which is more than 700 million people who are living in extreme poverty, right? So this is less than the $2 a day cited by the World Bank and others. And this extreme gap between those that have and have not is obviously widening. And it's part of the global trend that we're seeing that this gap is essentially increasing. And over the past 30 years, it's also been increasing at an increasing rate, which is also quite concerning. Um, and as well with this, that what we're seeing is that too often uh, women find that too often we find that women in particular are excluded, and this is one of the groups that's most negatively impacted by inequality. And we're also seeing the impact of climate change as well, in terms of how the rich elites are, taking out from the ground, taking out from the soil to further enrich themselves and are destroying the planet at the end of the day. So yeah, then the other area that we're working on is and we're calling for is a rejection of this sort of market fundamentalism, which Prof spoke to, and we need to build economies. We need to build alternative economies that put people and the planet first, right? Because that's not happening. People are just taking and taking without really thinking more deeply around the economic policies, the fundamental economic policies, fundamental, market fundamentalism as a policy, which has dominated, the global thinking on this issue. The other is that we need to build economies that don't discriminate against and exploit women, and I've touched on that in quite earlier as well. The other area that we're also working on is to mobilizing and working towards stopping the climate catastrophe, and by protecting communities that are directly affected and are directly affected by the impact of climate change, and the reliance on fossil fuels. We also want to make workers' rights a cornerstone of our economic model. Sorry, we want to make workers' rights of a cornerstone of the broader sort of economic model, and end corporate greed as a key area to work on. The other is make these wealthy corporations and big individuals pay their fair share of tax. We've all heard about these tax havens and transfer pricing, and these various financial outflows, which are essentially extracting again from developing countries in particular. We also are working towards rejecting the privatization of essential services and build strong, responsible states and ensure social protection for all. And the last one we want to do, the other one to work on is we're working towards is putting land back into the hands of women, smallholder farmers, and end the dominance of agribusiness. Um, yeah, then the last two quickly is to protect the democratic rights and civil society space in the face of growing inequality. Obviously, if you can't access the democratic space, if you can't speak out against it, against inequality, if there's no space for you to speak out against it, then it becomes difficult to fight and challenge that. Then the last area that we're also working towards is to protect rights of migrants and refugees, and in order to address the root causes of displacement. Yeah. So thanks. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Uyanda. I'm so glad that you mentioned climate in the way that you did. I mean, I think we that normally is a kind of afterthought, and I think that was important. But I don't want to look into what people have said too much now. I think we need to get to questions from you. I'm going to ask the three of you to please come up front here, so that we can engage with you more fully. Um, any questions? Let's volunteer first, wherever you may be. Okay, I'm going to take it like this then. Okay.
So, thank you for the time. My question is, okay, my name is Philip. My question is directed to Miss Isobel. So, I want to ask a question in relation to how the states is conducted, because normally I'm from the township. So, when it's about that time where they take, I think it's it's population calculation. I don't know. So they actually meet you on the way, and then they just ask you how many are you at home. Then you just give them numbers. We are five. So now I want to ask you if on the other side they might meet my little sister going somewhere. Then they ask her again, how many are you at home? Then she tells them we are five. So given that numbers there, it means now we are 12 instead of what? Instead of five people. So that causes a problem in terms of public service that the government has to provide. Because I think even the states calculating number of unemployed youth and all that, I don't think it's correct in the way.
Good afternoon, and thank you, panel, for being here with us. I just have short questions, and I think some of them are just both of them are just for clarification. So the first question to the stats, as he was doing. So I just wanted to know, with the other that we saw in the stats, I wanted to know those people, as you had said earlier, they had already given up on finding jobs. They're not economically participating. I guess. So my question will be, are they willing to get job? Are they willing to accept a job? Is the people in the other, are they willing to accept a job? And to Prof, my question, I didn't understand. I've been asking my colleagues, what exactly is the happiness principle? Thank you.
Um, okay, good afternoon to the panel. I was wondering if you could please just clarify the process by which when wealth ends up becoming concentrated in such extreme quantities. So how is it possible, or how does it happen that Jeff Bezos ends up with as much wealth as the GDP of Johannesburg, for example? I think that's.
I'm just going to take the fourth question.
Alrighty. Thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to ask the prof. You spoke about how in the 80s we were pro-socialism, and then jiggy jiggy out of nowhere, we're liberal government. Could it be due to the collapse of socialism?
Can you hear me? Right. Where shall I start? Let me start with quickly just to clarify on the question of socialism. I think that there was a very rich debate in the 80s and different ideas of what socialism meant. And what many of us inside the country, in the UDF and the trade unions, what we were much more skeptical about or even rejected explicitly was what was happening in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. We said that wasn't socialism. Some people said it was a form of state capitalism or bureaucratic statism. But that was what the Communist Party and the ANC looked to, and they still refer to as a socialist country. So that was a misnomer. And when that collapsed, it did delegitimize to some extent the idea of socialism. Whereas what was being argued for and fought for within the union movement and others outside the union movement was a democratic form of socialism. The precise dimensions of which, of course, we still, even today, are not fully clear about. And for example, what is happening in Sweden, is that a form of social democracy, a form of democratic socialism, where you have a combination of state and market, or do you have to transcend the market altogether? But statism and socialism need to be decoupled. They're two different things. How does wealth get concentrated? I think this is a very important point about what happened after the 1970s, because you had a global economic capitalist crisis in the 1970s, Um, and all the gains that were made between this, from the Second World War up until the 70s around um, redistribution of wealth into a whole range of areas like health, education, etc., especially in Western Europe and North America and other parts of the world. High taxation, right? In Sweden, taxation was at one point was up to 85%, or actually 92% taxation, right? In the USA in the 1950s, taxation was 75% for the richest, right? That, after the 1970s, was reduced dramatically. Right now, you have in the region of some countries even as low as 13%. I think in Ireland it's as low as 13%, because once you enter this global arena, the capitalist class then has more power. The nation state has less power, and they can negotiate. Well, if we don't reduce taxation, we'll go to another country, right? So in South Africa, our taxation rate also dropped dramatically down to, I think now it's about 25%. And they're too scared to go any further. Any suggestion of increasing taxation, they get frozen with fear because they're worried that capital will leave the country. So it's the question of the power of the nation state. And some people argue, of course, for global taxation and a global state, which is a very difficult thing to achieve, but of course that's the alternative to increasing power at the national level. Happiness. Now, the idea of gross national happiness, it's a very interesting idea, and I've visited this tiny country called Bhutan. It sits in between China and India. It's a Buddhist country, not exclusively Buddhist, but predominantly Buddhist. And the happiness principle is something that is promoted by Buddhism, but it's not confined to it. Aristotle talks about happiness, and the US Constitution, happiness is mentioned. I think even in the money is happiness there, if I'm not mistaken. So happiness is quite a broadly accepted concept, the pursuit of happiness. But Bhutan is the first country that has tried to implement this and to concretize it. So they have developed a methodology called the Gross National Happiness Index, right? Which is an alternative methodology to the GDP index and also to the HDI, the Human Development Index of the United Nations Development Program, which didn't go far enough in measuring social development. And they've got 9 domains. I've got a paper, actually I can circulate that if you want, which discusses this. How to measure things like education, health, psychological well-being, etc. 9 domains. And they do an extensive survey. They spend an hour with each person discussing these different dimensions of their well-being. And they're doing this, the aim is to do this every 3 years. So that's how they measure happiness, in short.
So just in terms of the answers to the questions, the suspicion of the statisticians, I'm not an employee of Stats SA. I know that we're not the first country to have undertaken surveys, and there are methods of triangulating your data to prevent you and your sister from being double counted. So a healthy degree of skepticism is useful, but with regards to the rigors of the sampling, those are quite transparent and they are available on Stats SA. I think just going to the other question about the definition of other, are they willing to accept a job? Yes, but you fall out of unemployed if you haven't actively sought a job. So if you haven't like spent money to go take a taxi to go and look for a job day after day, year after year, then you're no longer unemployed. So there is a level of willingness, but you haven't actually sent out your CV. You have not pursued an active search for a job in that period. I think just very briefly, the happiness index. I mean, one of the things, Devan, that you spoke to was the danger of looking at growth as being a determinant of development, which is very true. New Zealand has recently New Zealand's doing everything, um, including growing sheep. But what the Prime Minister, I'm assuming, has done, they're re-looking at economic growth, and they are actually saying that they don't want to promote growth, that growth is a rapacious and unsustainable kind of dynamic, and what they need to do is they need to use the economy to meet people's needs, and that will be the measurement of success, is if people's needs are met. Um, and I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I've just been reading a paper on the setting of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which is the UN replacement of the Millennium Development Goals, which weren't met. Um, and this paper sets out the process of setting the indicators, because you've got targets, 12. You've got a number of targets, 16, 17. See, a number, under 20 of targets. And then to work out how well they're doing, they've got indicators, progress indicators along the way for each of those. And this person was arguing that the politics of deciding on the indicators is huge, because that determines how a country has to take into account the meeting of them. And they had a big issue with inequality, and how inequality was basically defined away as being an effective goal. So I think that's useful to look at. And then also just this concept for us in South Africa of progressive realization, because I mentioned, I mean, Section 27 gives us all the right to food, to water. Section 26 gives you the right to shelter, so that's housing, healthcare, social security. Basically, all our needs should be met. But then the constitutional writers said that the state didn't have to give that to everybody immediately, but through progressive realization based on available resources, which is where the taxation comes in as well. So one of the things that we at SPII did was to say, but some of these things have not been shifting. In the 2000s, government got into, or still 2000, in the early 2000s, government got into this whole habit of talking about the poorest of the poor. Like only the poorest of the poor should get anything. So basically targeting, taking away people's rights, in effect. And so one of our projects has been to develop indicators looking, well, we do budget analysis and policy analysis of the line departments in terms of their spend. Are they committing to universal enjoyment, and are they giving budget allocation to universal enjoyment? And then using, again, the statistical survey from GHS, et cetera, to see whether the enjoyment is increasing over time. And that's really useful, because nobody actually monitors those kind of those socioeconomic rights violations. In terms of the first generation of rights, the political and civil rights, it's easier to measure the number of people who've disappeared, the kind of the political deaths. But measuring socioeconomic rights and the violations of socioeconomic rights is quite a fundamental challenge, is a polite way of putting it. And so I think one of the things that in your own development of your tools and your critical analysis, it's crucial to understand how you can do that, and how you can contribute to that kind of community of theory around that.
This is just a quick question. So I just wanted to ask, with regards to people who are employed, if they work 1 hour in one day, right? So I just want to know, so why did we get the definition to be, why did it get to be that at that point? Because maybe people are, isn't it a maximum of 36 to 40 hours a week that's going to determine if you're employed or not? So
Alrighty. I just wanted to ask, could poverty, all right, okay, could poverty be caused by lack of financial literacy? Because in South Africa, we find that, yes, we have people who earn, right? They will earn maybe 15 to 25,000 rands, but within 5 to 10 days of payday, they are broke. And I'm trying to imagine how it would then be with someone who earns a grant, which is like 430 a month. Some are accused of gambling the money or whatever. But could it be that our poverty because we are a much better educated country than we were 25, 30 years ago. However, we still have poverty as an issue. Could it not just be access to jobs, but rather the manner in which we use our money?
I have a question for the gentleman at the end. You said education as a means to an end, and not as an end itself. And then you said, do we know the value of education? So my question is, looking at the state of our country currently, what is the value of education, especially to youngsters? What would you say?
Okay, I'll just respond briefly to the troubled letter on this unemployment definition. I'm glad that you are pursuing it. So the definitions that we employ are developed globally by the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization, which represents government, business, and labor on a global basis. And they're different definitions. They also had the expanded definition that took the non-unemployed, the non-employed into consideration. And then about 15 years ago, government decided to shift from the expanded, broader definition to the narrow one. So I think it's also just to be cognizant of the fact, so that's the definition of unemployed. The criteria that you are mentioning is the criteria for employment as a work, for protection as a worker. So the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and the Labor Relations Act kick in when you've worked a certain threshold in terms of your working hours. So those two definitions are not interlinked. I think one of the things, just to comment briefly on what Devan was saying in terms of taxation, again, it's mind-blowing. I mean, when you talk about the states having a taxation rate of 75%, that means that for every 1 rand that we would have earned, we would only have kept 25 cents of that rand. And the balance was the cost that was required to run the state and for the redistribution. I mean, now just to comment on your top South African tax rate, the marginal tax rate is 42%. So basically, the more you earn, the greater the take is. But globally, there's been a shift from public expenditure to private expenditure. The assumption being that if you're able to earn, you should be able to provide for yourselves. And that's a significant pauperization of people who are paying their taxes. They're just not getting anything back. And so you get the pushback against tax revenue raising. People are saying, I'm not prepared to pay my tax. And linked to that is this neoliberal theory that any state is a bad state, so we need to reduce that. And then we get to the public sector wage bill, but then that's another debate.
So I'll take the two questions, the one around poverty and the one around education. What do I think is the value of education? So I think with education, with poverty, let me start with poverty. With poverty, I think it's one of the things that, the globalized capitalist world wants us to believe is that, poverty is self-made by an individual, when in fact it's a consequence of the structural causes of poverty in the first place. So, society, you have money, you can meet your needs, you shouldn't be poor. Those people that have excess money and meet their needs aren't necessarily considered poor. It's those that are outside of that that are also directly impacted by the structural causes of poverty. Those are the ones that we're most concerned about. Those are the ones that are most experiencing the impacts of inequality and poverty. And also, I think linked to that as well is the state's ability to provide social services to also, fight against poverty. Its policies should be driven at fighting against poverty. The state policy should be there to ensure that the state, that there's a consistent and a concerted effort to fight against poverty at a state level. So that's what should be happening, as opposed to considering it as an individual who's earning X amount and therefore uses that X amount. Chances are, by that stage, when you're spending X amount, you've already met majority of your needs. You have a roof over your head. You have access to clean water. You have, you have access to clean water and food and so forth. And then the one on education. So I think maybe just to explain myself a little bit better, when I spoke about not seeing education as a means to an end, but an end in itself, right? I'm going to put a number of caveats on this one. Is that I think that sometimes there's particularly with where South Africa is, and particularly with seeing the figures around education being able to pull people out of poverty. I think it's very important for education to be able to do that to do that. But I think part of that we should also be reflective and think quite deeply about why it is that we're learning. Why is it that we're gaining education? Why are we studying? Are we studying simply because we want to earn a job? Or are we studying because we want to be critical about the world that we live in, want to be able to sharpen our ideas, want to be able to improve in the knowledge production? So for me, I think bringing it back home and obviously being grounded in a specific reality, I think for me, it's a combination of both, right? It's a combination of being able to be able to uh, live a decent life, earn a decent wage, but also understand that the tools that we're getting in our studies are supposed to help us make the world a better place. Are supposed to help us critique and sharpen our ideas in terms of what world we want to live in, what sort of society we want to live in.
It's not a lack of whatever, it is basic hunger. Um, and I think that's what we must realize. Thank you so much for your inputs, and I really hope that these sessions today has provided you with knowledge to develop new insights and critically look at your own views. So thank you very much.